Okay, um, this is my third attempt at trying to record this lecture. Wish me luck. I'm trying this from home because it was lost the last two times. We had been talking about looking at waves as a major process in determining issues of coastal problems, mainly coastal erosion. And so fundamental to understanding these coastal problems and their potential solutions, we need to have a good grasp of certain basic concepts, including wave climate, sediment budget, and littoral cells. So if we look at the wave climate, this is a statistical characterization over a year or annual basis of wave energy being largely measured by height and period, and the direction of the waves determine the direction or dispersal of the wave energy. If we look at the variables that control wave energy, they begin with the wind, because remember, waves are basically getting their energy from the wind. So the higher the velocity, the higher the amount of wind energy, therefore the higher amount of energy available to be transported to the waves. In addition, the length of time that the winds are blowing, the longer the duration, the greater the amount of wave energy generated from the wind. And lastly, the fetch, the distance over which the wind is blowing. The greater the distance gives more exposure to the ocean, to the wind energy, and therefore the greater the wave energy. Now, if you look at the kinetic and potential energy of a wave, it's basically proportional to the square of the amplitude, or I'm going to refer to it as square of the height, the amplitude being twice the height of the wave. We could also look at wave power. There are various reasons to do that, and here's where period comes in. Wave power is proportional to the period times the height of the wave squared, okay? And so period and height are basically our variables that we're concerned with in terms of working out the wave budget. Now, if we look at where the areas of highest waves are, you can see areas along here in the North Pacific, North Atlantic, and also down here along the southern hemisphere storm belts. These are areas of highest waves, frankly, because they are the areas of highest winds, and they are the area of highest winds because these are the storm belts. These are basically areas where the polar easterlies are coming in contact with the prevailing westerlies, and so that's where our storms are, and that's where the high wind velocity and area and fetches and durations are. Now, if we look at that wave energy and propagate it to the shoreline, we can see what the impact of that offshore wave energy is on the coastal zone. So let's take an area in your text here from Oxnard Shores near LA and look at the distribution of waves that are coming in. And so, for example, this is the, what we call a rose diagram, and we're getting relatively short period waves, 5 to 10 second waves all year round from both the sea breeze and local coastal storms. We're also getting some long period, let's say 12, well, moderate period, 12-second waves from the west and northwest that are generated during storms. And then in the summer, we're getting some very long period waves that are actually generated from southern hemisphere winter storms propagating all the way across the Pacific. And these are very long period waves, 23-second waves coming in from the south. And we also have some waves coming in from the southwest. Now notice what we've defined as direction and period, and also to a certain extent winter versus summer. You might also notice there are some areas that are protected. Essentially, Oxnard Shores is protected from waves in certain direction because of the distribution of offshore islands. Now, it's not just period, of course, though, it's wave height. And so if we look at the distribution of wave height and direction, and we take these from offshore buoys that record wave period and height all year round, we see the strongest amount rather the highest waves heights, and therefore the largest amount of energy and duration, is coming in from the northwest. And these are our northern hemisphere storms coming in, bringing northwesterly waves with very high energy. And you'll notice some smaller height waves. These are those southern hemisphere summer waves that are coming in as long period swell waves. So if we take information from these wave roses and period information from these offshore buoys and multiple buoys, then we can basically transform that energy to what's hitting the beach itself. Now that energy that's coming in annually affects the annual sediment budget. That's essentially a summary of the sources and sinks of sediment along the beach, and it determines the net loss or gain, or if you like, stability of the beach throughout the year. Simplistically, if you like, the rate at which sediment, here I mean mainly sand, is being removed, and that's mainly by wave energy, realizing it'll vary with season and with location, versus the rate at which it's being resupplied, which is a sediment supply question. So what is the source, or what are the sources of sediment supply? Well, the two main ones are rivers and coastal erosion. They provide the bulk of the initial sediment into the coastal zone. But there's a third source of sediment, and that's longshore drift. And what that really is taking the sediment that's been introduced to the beach by rivers and erosion and moving it laterally. So it provides now a source of sediment for adjacent beaches downdrift. And you could also imagine it provides a process by which sediment is removed by longshore drift as well. Longshore drift is particularly important, that is, in terms of a sediment supply, when we start talking about coastal structures that are intended to somehow provide some level of protection. So we're going to see how important interrupting the sediment budget is when we interrupt the longshore drift. Now, there are some other minor sources of sediment locally important, for example, offshore winds and in the polar regions, glaciers. And in many areas, human activity can be an important source of sediment as well. Now, in order to look at the distribution of the sediment, let's take an example. Let's look at Freeport, which is near the coast along the Brazos River. Here, by the way, is Oyster Creek. You might remember that as being the ancestral Brazos River before it was abandoned by river avulsion to become the modern Brazos. Today, the modern Brazos comes here, and it introduces sediment at the Brazos mouth to the coast as river-derived sediment. So that's one primary source. A second source would be wave erosion along in here. So we've got sediment being introduced into the coastal zone by that combination of river-derived and erosion-derived sediment. That sediment, in turn, is being transported laterally, so it's now a supply of sediment to beaches that are downdrift. In this particular case, the dominant direction of longshore currents is to the south. Sinks, well, the biggest, most obvious sink here is the Brazos Delta. There's more sediment coming into this system by the river than the waves can remove, so we have a net surplus of sediment, and therefore that allows the deposition of sediment and progradation of the land to form a delta. Okay? And there is also during storms that cannot come back to the beach, so that's a second source of sink in this particular area. The geographic distribution of the sources and sinks in the coastal zone is best defined by a concept referred to as littoral cells. And a littoral cell is essentially the equivalent, the coastal equivalent of a drainage basin that defines areas of interest with respect to sediment being supplied, transported, and deposited. Here, the river is the source of the sediment. The sediment is being transported laterally by wave-induced longshore currents, and it's being ultimately removed by submarine canyons. So here we have something analogous to a narrow drainage basin where that sediment is coming in. Now, one of the things you might think about is the fact that because rivers are primary sediment sources for the coastline, any change that affects the sediment in a river is ultimately going to affect everything downstream, including the beach. So if we were to build a dam, for example, right here, trap the sediment, what would happen to the beach? Well, the beach has lost a lot of its sediment. The waves are still strong, and so we actually see beach erosion. And so one of the consequences of building dams in coastal rivers in Southern California is, because of the change in the sediment supply, an increase of erosion downdrift within the littoral cell that's being fed by that particular river system. So here we have a typical littoral cell. We've got the headlands erosion here, supplying sediment. We're also adding sediment here, erosion here. We're adding a little sediment by wind. We're removing it by submarine canyons, by onshore winds, and of course there's offshore and onshore transport during storms. So all of these are calculations that we would have to take into account to determine what is the sediment budget at any particular location. And this is just an example of some of those sediment cells where we have submarine canyons that are effectively terminating the cell. So any sediment that's produced along here cannot get past this canyon. So there's another cell to this canyon and another one to this canyon. So it allows us to subdivide the coastline much as we would subdivide the land with respect to drainage basins. And this is just another illustration here showing just the size and scope of these submarine canyons. These canyons are sometimes within 100 yards of the shoreline, but they are as big or bigger than the Grand Canyon. So these are tremendous geomorphic features that are virtually unseen, yet almost within a stone's throw of the beach. And their role is to provide a permanent sink and a termination of those littoral cells in this particular coastal zone. Now, let's look at some of those variables that we talked about in terms of wave height, wave period, and ultimately wave energy. When the wind blows in a particular direction, it sets waves into motion in that same direction because of the transfer of energy. And you can think of it somewhat as a sinusoidal wave, but it's a little different because actually the wave motion is orbital, and that's why these waves are referred to as orbital waves or orbital ocean waves. And the maximum amount of energy is right here at the surface, and it decreases with depth. Okay, so let's look at each of these concepts separately. First of all, here's that orbital motion with the motion at the crest moving forward, the motion at the trough moving backwards, and the motion at any one spot is basically making an orbital circle. Okay, the height of that, actually this is amplitude, the height of the wave, if you like, the square of the height, is a measure of wave energy. So these waves are getting bigger and bigger, higher and higher, as energy increases. The wavelength is the space between two crests, and the period is the time it takes for basically to move one wavelength. Okay. And so the wave power would be a function of the square of those wave heights as well as the periodicity. Okay. Now, because the maximum energy is at the surface and that energy dissipates with depth because of frictional attenuation due to the molecular viscosity of the water, there is a depth below which there's no significant wave motion, no significant wave energy. Essentially, that orbital diameter decreases until it's sufficiently small that we call it negligible, and that depth, it turns out, is 1/2 the wavelength. So that's an important measure of whether or not the wave is being influenced by the bottom, or conversely, that the wave energy has an influence on the bottom. Okay. Let's subdivide water depth into depth below. Let's see, I don't want to do this. Okay, that depth below wave base and depth above wave base. Okay, so let's see what's going on. Okay, we are still recording, so let me go back. Okay, I think we're back to where we were. If we look at the deep water wave, we define a deep water wave as a wave that's in water depths deeper than its wave base. And conversely, a shallow water wave in water depths less than its wave base, until we reach a depth that is about, let me see if I can do this, a depth that is about equal as wave height, and that's the breaker zone. If we look at that deep water wave, it doesn't feel bottom. And it doesn't matter if it's 2 feet below wave base or 2,000 feet below wave base. It just doesn't feel the bottom. Whereas a shallow water wave, if you like, not only feels the bottom, but you could imagine that there is a drag on that wave, and so that wave is going to start slowing down because it is increasingly have frictional attenuation of that wave energy by friction with the bottom. Okay. Now, there are a whole bunch of terms, but they're really pretty straightforward that I'll be referring to. The wavelength, the wave height, and the wave period. I haven't mentioned the speed of the wave, but clearly the speed of the wave is going to determine the wave period based on the wavelength. That's the celerity of the wave base, which is 1/2 the wavelength, the water depth, and the deep water wave versus shallow water wave. So kind of keep these concepts in mind as we look at the changes that occur in a wave as it approaches the beach. And here we have our deep water wave until the wave begins to feel bottom, and then eventually it's going to come onto the shore. So let's see what goes on here. Well, in order to look at how that wave changes, we need to look at the speed, or celerity if you like, that the wind-generated wave travels, and that depends on whether or not it's a deep water or a shallow water wave. So if we ask ourselves, what is the celerity, or what variable controls the celerity of a deep water wave? Remember, those are waves that are not influenced by depth. It turns out it's the period. The longer the period, the faster the wave. Okay, the shorter the period, the slower the wave. Okay, and that doesn't change until it begins to feel bottom. And so once the wave begins to feel bottom, once it's become a shallow water wave, it begins to slow down with depth. And so the less depth, the less velocity. It slows down as the water shallows. Okay, the slower the wave, or rather the more shallow the water, the slower the wave. Okay, so we could just say as a generalization that deep water waves depend on wave period, and shallow water waves depend on water depth. Okay. Well, what's happening in that area where we're becoming shallow water wave? Well, okay, the wave slows down, and it's slowing down because it's getting more shallow, and so we get into a zone that we call the zone of wave buildup. So here we have our transition from deep water to shallow water wave, and that is essentially the zone of wave buildup until the wave actually breaks at the breaker zone. So what happens here? Well, it turns out the period remains constant. It's the one conservative value that we have. The height of the wave is increasing as it slows down. Because it's slowing down, the wavelength or spacing of the wave crest decrease. And because it's slowing down, the velocity is decreasing, wave refraction can occur. Okay? Wave refraction, you'll remember from our discussion of seismic waves, is the bending of waves as they change velocity. So here they're going fast, and here they're going slow. Okay, and let's just look at this a little more. Here are the wave crests. This is the wave length. And notice that the wave crests are getting closer as they're slowing down. And notice also the black arrows are the wave rays. Now the wave rays, as we talked about earlier, are the measures of the direction of wave energy movement, and it's always at right angles to the wave crest. So here we have a photo of wave refraction off East Galveston. Again, you can see the bending of those waves. Okay. Now, as those waves bend, and here would be the offshore point, let's say maybe where water begins to, pardon me, waves begin to slow down. They bend towards the shoreline, and in this particular case, towards the headlands. Notice how with a headlands area, the wave refraction tends to focus the wave energy on that headland. And conversely, when we have an open bay, the wave refraction tends to cause the wave energy to spread out. And as a result, we have an increased amount of erosion. We are literally focusing energy on the wave headlands, and we are dispersing the energy, and therefore we are causing deposition in the bays, and that's simply because of a longshore difference in the wave energy and in the sediment budget. Okay, so here we have a zone of wave buildup. It's kind of hard to tell, but this wave, it's not just perspective, it's actually getting higher until finally it breaks. Okay, so this is a zone of wave buildup going into the zone where the wave is just too unstable, it's too high, and it falls over. Okay, so here we see the uniform spacing of the and straight crest of the waves offshore. This then must be more or less the depth between deep water and shallow water waves. If I knew the scale of this photo, I could actually measure the wavelength, and I could divide by 2, and I could say that's that depth. And notice it's curving more and more. Okay. But it's never quite coming directly onshore. It continues to have a slightly oblique direction of motion, and that generates longshore currents. Okay. So let's look at this zone here from the waves breaking until it actually hits the beach. We've gone through the zone of wave buildup. It's where the waves break and then pass through the surf zone and onto the swash zone that most of the action occurs. This is where you get the erosion and transport and deposition of sediment. So here we have waves breaking, and now they're moving across as high energy surf zone deposits that are going to generate currents, and that these currents parallel to the shoreline are going to generate a longshore or littoral transport of sediment. And that transport is occurring within the surf zone and the swash zone. Now we subdivide that transport of sediment into that sediment that's transported in the surf zone by longshore currents generated by the oblique wave energy that's approaching the shore, That is referred to as longshore drift. And we also have sediment that's being transported within the swash zone, and that is referred to as beach drift. Okay, so here we have wave refraction, the zone of wave buildup. We have longshore currents, and we have that zigzag motion. Let's look at that here. Here we have water depths of 1/2 the wavelength. That's the wave base. We have we have water depths about equal to the wave height. That's the breaker zone. And water depths of 0, well, that's going to be the shoreline. So we have the zone of wave buildup, the breaker zone, surf zone, swash zone. Now here's our longshore current that's set up within the surf zone. That's going to give us our longshore drift. And we have this beach drift, which is that angular sediment that's moved up by the direction of waves and down by gravity. Up by waves, down by gravity. So the combination of beach drift and longshore current is our littoral transport. Okay. So here's our breaker zone in white. Then we see the surf zone and the swash zone, and we see this longshore current, and we could also envision that zigzag movement in the swash zone. Now, I've already mentioned that the main sources of sediment are rivers and erosion and longshore current drift. So let's see how we can look at those sources and how they might change with time and how that might change the sediment budget. Now, let's imagine that you're interested in buying a beach house here on Quintana Beach. Now, you're being the sophisticated person that you are, you're going to go to the geologic literature and you're going to get a paper that shows the net shoreline change for 125 years. And it turns out that that is in an area that's shown net accretion, essentially a positive sediment budget. Looks pretty good. But things aren't always as they seem. Here's Quintana Beach, and there's the Brazos River. Remember, we talked about that earlier. Now, if you look at where it is and where the net amount of deposition was, this is an area of deposition. But if you look at a map, a 1942 map, here's the area of beach in 1942, and see that red line there? Well, that's the 1976 shoreline. So there's been this much erosion from 42 to 76. So why would that be? Well, that's simply because Dow Chemical didn't want all that sediment in its along the Brazos River to get into the water that it was using for producing manganese and other chemical things. So they talked the Corps of Engineers into blocking off that mouth of the river and diverting the river to the south, southwest. North is like this. This would be an artificial avulsion. Well, turns out there was a large delta here because that was an area of sediment surplus until the river was diverted. And like a dam, the sediment now is being intercepted from these beaches and has been shifted to the beaches to the south. So now the beaches to the south have a net surplus of sediment, a positive sediment budget, and the beaches to the north went from a positive to a negative balance. So we've got erosion, not deposition. And the problem is that if you look at the aggregate from 1853 to 74 is positive. But if you look at the interval until 1930, just prior to the diversion, this was the delta. And then if you look at what's been going on, actually, we could have looked from 1930 to 1973. I just took a shorter interval. This is where the deposition has been shifted now to here, and this is erosion. Now, this really tells an important story because what it says is, kind of like river discharge or flood data, the longest record is not always the most appropriate because things might change. So whenever we try to predict the future by using the past, we have to assume that nothing has changed in that drainage basin, or in this particular case, in the sediment supply for the littoral cell or that coastline. But things have changed. The sedimentation rate prior to 1932, or the diversion, is completely irrelevant, and in fact is misleading if you take the aggregate rate. And so you need to look at the historical record, be it flooding or coastal change, that is consistent with the situation today and in the future. Okay. Now, as I'd mentioned in the previous lecture, the vast majority of the Texas beaches are either eroding or at best stable. There's less than 10% that have a positive sediment budget. So here's an article that's complaining that we got too much sand coming along the beach, and that's really kind of an odd thing because erosion is normally the issue that seems to be of most concern. So I thought I'd look into that, and sure enough, the San Bernard River comes in through here, just downdrift of the Brazos River, and the supply of sediment to the mouth of the San Bernard River is actually less the San Bernard River than longshore currents bringing sediment from the Brazos River. And so as the Brazos River has been depositing sediment and growing, and notice the asymmetry of the delta, the shoreline has been growing seaward and downdrift. And so what it's doing is it's heading towards the mouth of the San Bernard River. And if you fast forward, this is from 1971, fast forward to today, we can begin to see some interesting changes. Let's look at that a little more closely. Notice how that river, or I'm sorry, how that delta is progressively providing so much sediment to the coast that it's deflecting the mouth of the Brazos River. Okay, it's deflecting it downdrift. We can see the beach accretion ridges, not unlike point bar ridges that we might see in a river, and compare that with what it was in 1971. Well, here's that 1971. Here it is today. We can see some erosion that's going on, more sediment supplied from part of the delta, and then deposition. This is through actually from 1974 to the year 2000. Okay, so in 2000 you see the deflection of the river. Well, today the river just stops. There's not enough water coming through the river so that it's completely closed. That's what people were saying. There's too much sediment. So they're going to have to build an artificial inlet here if you want to take boats in and out of the San Bernard River, all because of a change in sediment budget. In this case, again, from the Brazos River, moving downdrift. Now let's go back to that Quintana Beach area where we first thought we'd build a condo because it's an area of net deposition. Well, now we know it's not, and in fact, we can predict that in a 50-year period, there will be about, it says 60 years here, I really meant 50, there'll be about 900 feet of erosion. So this is an area that's eroding, one of the fastest erosion rates of any place along the Texas coast. Okay. And of course, homes that were built in that area well behind the dunes and behind the vegetation line are now actually trespassing on state land. So what do we do? What can we do about the fact that most of our beaches, or rather most of coastal land, is subject to erosion? Okay, and like flooding, we basically have two approaches. We can take a structural approach where we build something to prevent it from happening, It could be groins or jetties or seawalls or breakwaters, or we could take non-structural approaches like beach nourishment, zoning, abandonment, etc. Okay, so let's begin with the structural approach, and let's begin with groins. These are structures that are at right angles to the shoreline, and their purpose is to trap sediment, change the sediment budget to either prevent or at least reduce beach erosion. And they look kind of like this. Here are these perpendicular structures. And the idea is that sediment will be trapped. And actually, let's just take an example of that. Here's an eroding beach, and you are here, and your neighbors are here. And you're all in danger. So what you do, you build a groin. And sure enough, that sediment supply doesn't leave. So you've kept sediment coming into your system through longshore drifts that otherwise would have gone right past you, and so you have net deposition. The problem is that sediment isn't getting to your neighbor's beach, and so now you've decreased the amount of sediment source for your beach, your neighbor, and so they're beginning to see erosion. Well, now they're mad at you, and they have to build a groin, which makes this neighbor say, I got to build a groin, and I got to build a groin. So where does it end? You're literally passing the buck. Groins are kind of like peanuts. You just can't stop with one. And in fact, you kind of see that of impact. So let's first of all look at this series of groins here and look at the asymmetry of sediment supply. You can tell the direction of longshore drift. You can tell that it's moving in this direction because of the nature of the updrift pile of sediment. Okay? Now look a little more closely. Look at this updrift pile of sediment and look where the groins stop. Well, they got to stop somewhere, and of course they stopped where the houses stopped. But look at the shoreline. Tremendous amount of erosion and overwash. And that's simply because once the groins stop, then you've got nothing but a sediment deficit. And the waves, of course, the wave energy, it hadn't changed. The sediment budget has. Okay. Here's another example. Here we have a series of groins, and now the direction of longshore drift is to the south. And look at all this erosion that occurred here and not here. Well, that's because there had been downdrift erosion associated with the end of the jetties. Now, unlike the previous example where we basically had just a large area of wetlands, here you had homes. And also look at the width of the beach now, or better said, the width of the island, because this is a barrier island. Okay, it's significantly narrowed in this here. Okay, so we've got increased downdrift erosion because you're at the downdrift end of a groin field, and we see that the island itself has significantly narrowed. So what happens? Another storm comes and you actually cut the island in two. Okay, and so here are the homes, here were the homes, and this is the end of that groin system. So we see the long-term effect of jetties is to protect the updrift area and cause major disruption in the downdrift area, not unlike upstream channelization and downstream erosion or increased flooding. Now, look at this inlet for a second. This inlet, under natural conditions, might fill, but of course, these aren't natural conditions. There's not much sediment. But there are some times when you may actually want to keep an inlet open. Okay, and if you, for that, you're going to build a jetty. And jetties are these impermeable structures perpendicular to the shoreline on either side of an inlet. The inlet could be an inlet through a barrier island, or it could be actually a river mouth, like at a delta. And here, the primary purpose is not so much to prevent erosion, but rather prevent deposition of sediment in the inlet, and thereby improve navigation. So here we have our jetty, and the idea is you increase You keep the velocity high here, and you transport sediment to water depths farther offshore, where it can be deposited, and rather than being deposited in the shallow channel. So it reduces maintenance and navigation. It's meant to improve navigation. But here's the waves coming in, and they're piling up against the jetty just as if it were a groin. The beach processes can't tell the difference between a jetty and a groin. Well, what's going to happen here? The sediment that used to be able to go around the river's mouth is now trapped. And so we have downdrift erosion. Okay. Here we have an inlet that was cut here in order to prevent having to go through this channel, which has a lot of sediment in it, okay, to get to Matagorda Bay. And if we look at it more closely, here's the jetties, here and here, and look at the pileup of sediment. The direction of longshore drift, again, being to the southwest. Here we have the shoreline, actually the vegetation line. Now I guess you could call it shoreline. In 1942, and here you have it in 2008. So you've had almost 800 meters of aggradation in this period of time. And you can see the wave approach at an oblique angle, and you can envision the fact that the waves are coming in at an oblique angle, generating that longshore current, and the pileup of sediment here and the erosion of sediment there. Okay. Now, storms, particularly along thin barrier islands, can actually break the island up into a whole bunch of little storm-generated channels. But longshore drift will fill that up. Okay. Now, one of the problems, though, is that those areas are, once formed, are going to be naturally occurring areas to breach again. Okay. So we have a history of these thin islands, these thin barrier islands being breached by storms and then healed by longshore drift deposition later, unless we've done something to try to prevent it. So here's a case where we did something to try to prevent it. If you look at the 1800s, there was a very long island off of Delaware called Fenwick Island, and then in 1933, a hurricane produced an inlet, not unlike what we saw in that previous example in New York. But because Fenwick Island was so long, the fishermen that lived on the land had to go a great distance to get to the natural inlet. So they liked the idea of this shortcut. So they decided to put up jetties here in order to keep that inlet open for their ships. And they've done that. And updrift of that, we now have Ocean City. Downdrift of that, well, we've got a lot of erosion. In fact, if you look at the shoreline in 49, which was here, and you look at the shoreline today, here are the jetties, my gosh, look how much erosion has occurred. Okay, over 1,000 meters. Okay, very much like what we see here on a smaller scale. Okay. That island has actually migrated more than one island width. And one of the things you might notice is look at the change in the width of the bay behind the island. Eventually, that island will weld itself onto the mainland, all because of the building of these jetties. Okay. Now, a third thing we could do, we could build a seawall or a revetment, and basically this is something that's built parallel to the shore and on the landward side of the beach. We know it best as the Galveston seawall. Now, the purpose of a seawall is different from that of a jetty or a groin, and that is it's to prevent erosion of the land adjacent to the beach. It's not meant to protect the beach itself. Now, here we see a seawall that was built that protected the land, the town in this case, but there was no beach. Erosion continued to remove sediment. There was no sediment being introduced. Remember, erosion is a source of sediment as well as a mechanism to remove land, the removal of land is basically to provide sediment for the beach. And so you prevent that beach from being resupplied by sand, it narrows and eventually disappears. Now, there may be a reason, though, to build a seawall, and the reason is that in some cases you can lose a city. This is Galveston after the 1900 hurricane, and literally it was completely destroyed except for a little island that survived. And it survived mainly because of the accumulation of debris from the houses in that area of total devastation. That total devastation was essentially just beveled. And where those houses go, well, they began to form a dam. And it's inside that dammed up area that what little of the historic districts we have left are presently preserved today. The Victorian areas, Victorian houses, the historical district of Galveston is essentially within that corridor that was saved by that debris dam. Okay. And you can see some of the houses and pieces of houses. Okay. Now, because of the devastation of that event, Galveston really had to rethink. Let's see, maybe it'll never happen again. Well, that's not likely. Maybe we should just move. Oh gosh, that doesn't seem appealing, because the fact of the matter is that Galveston was the second most important port in the entire United States, and by far the most important city in Texas at the time. Or we could try to do something to save Galveston. So they built a seawall, and they built it 17 feet high, because that's how high the storm surge was. They built it kind of shaped like this in order to deflect the wave energy. They put this large rocks here to prevent it from being eroded away. They sunk shafts down to try to anchor it. And then, oh, by the way, they raised the ground. This seawall, that kind of shaped like this was the land before. They literally raised the ground and raised houses. The house that was down here, they jacked it up, in some cases 17 feet. And so Galveston now, the old part of Galveston, is protected by this raised wedge or prism of sediment and the seawall itself. So here was the seawall afterwards, and notice now the houses are at the level of the seawall, adjacent to the seawall, and gradually taper down to the backside of the beach. And there's a wide beach. Major recreational area, and notice they built the seawall on the landward side of the beach. And so life is good. Now, we'll just skip this one for a second, but it turns out there was another hurricane. Good thing they didn't assume it wouldn't happen again. 15 years later. May have been as large as the previous hurricane, but very few people lost their lives. And the reason was the seawall combined with the raising of the land. Okay. So here we have it after. Notice the beach looks kind of narrow, and in fact, the beach goers are all kind of crowded right along this rocky, narrow ledge of the beach. That's not much of a beach. In fact, you see is more sand piled up against the rocks. Okay. The reality is there is no beach, or better said, was no beach. They put groins in the 1930s to try to trap the sediment, but there's no sediment to trap. So the seawall was basically an area of protected land, but no beach. All of that sediment that was there, pretty much most of it was lost in the 1915 storm, and what was left was removed in storms after that. The other thing that happens, of course, if you build a seawall, is not only do you not protect the beach in front of the seawall, but you prevent beach erosion along that stretch. Or rather, not beach erosion, but you protect land erosion. And you might think, well, duh, that's the whole purpose. But one of the unintended consequences of preventing erosion is to trap sediment. Now, we're not trapping it behind a groin or a jetty. We're trapping it behind a seawall. So what happens downdrift? Well, increased erosion. This was the shoreline in 1961. This is the shoreline later in 1987. This is how much erosion was occurring. Accelerated erosion at the end of the seawall. Okay. You used to be able to drive down. This ramp was designed for your cars. You wouldn't do it today. Now, it didn't do so well after Hurricane Ike, but actually that seawall has been remarkably effective in doing what it was designed to do, protect the old part of Galveston. Okay, the damage that was done in Ike was really the first major damage in 105 years. Okay, but we can see that one of the consequences of building that seawall is downdrift erosion. Okay. Now, the last of the structural features are breakwaters, and these are basically structures that are put offshore, and their purpose is to minimize wave energy by breaking down the waves with this offshore barrier in order to either protect the beach or to protect boats, like a marina. Okay, so here's a breakwater here, and you can see how the water has, or the beach has grown. So beach growth protected behind a breakwater is kind of an interesting phenomenon. In fact, here's a breakwater, a very famous one I should add, the breakwater at Santa Monica. And notice here the boats. The breakwater that was actually built in order to provide a safe haven, but also notice this bulge of sediment. Okay. Here was the proposed Santa Monica breakwater, and here's the famous Santa Monica Pier here. Okay, this is what it looked like before the breakwater was built, and this is after it was built. You see the boats, you see the breakwater, and you see beach accretion. Now, why would it accrete? Well, think about what a breakwater does. It reduces the wave energy. And of course, if you want to anchor your boat, that's good. But reducing the wave energy also reduces the longshore current, because the longshore current is set up by the incoming waves in the surf zone. And the strength of that current is a function of the wave energy. So you've got sediment coming in. You haven't done anything to the sediment budget updrift of the breakwater, but here the wave energy goes to zero, sediment supply is still there, so you have beach accretion. Now, by the way, you also have downdrift erosion. For the very same reason as all the other features, we are intercepting the sediment, in this case because of the decrease in wave energy, and that is causing a deficit in the sediment budget here, and therefore beach erosion. Now, you might think, okay, that's bad here, but at least we got what we want here. We got a big beach and we got a protected harbor, except it turns out that that sediment is also piling up behind the shoreline and behind the breakwater. It's making that marina more and more shallow. It is silting in the marina. Well, that's the whole point of that, keeping that as a protected area. We don't want it to silt up, yet the inevitable consequence of interrupting the sediment budget and interrupting the longshore drift did that. So what's the answer? Turns out the answer is put a dredge here and mechanically move the water. Okay, and I think we're going to, mechanically move the sediment from here to here. So now we have artificially reestablished that zone of longshore drift. Okay, so the question of what do these all have in common is obvious. They all cause downdrift erosion. Okay? That's a problem. Okay, well, also, the problem is we've got a lot of landowners, both primary and secondary homes, that are losing their homes because of the continued erosion. And so you begin to see an issue of what do we do to prevent erosion of the beaches? Okay, and it says everybody remembers the beach now. When they go back, in some cases, it no longer exists. So that's kind of scary that we're losing our beaches. We're amazed how much beach was lost. In some cases, they're already gone. So we need a state financial commitment to erosion prevention. Okay, well now, be careful. Because the statement our beaches are eroding is largely fiction. The fact is, for the most part, the beaches are moving. Okay, what is a fact is that it's the beachfront property that's eroding. So remember what happens if this is the beach today from, let's say, here to the vegetation line. And then we have erosion. This is the beach tomorrow. The beach has moved. We didn't lose the beach. The only way we're actually going to lose the beach is if we set up a seawall here, or something comparable to a seawall, and that beach will eventually erode away. Okay. So for most cases, our erosional shorelines are not losing beach. The beach just is moving. So what you see when you see these things, we must protect our beaches, is really that's kind of code for we must protect our beachfront property. Well, now sometimes that's an important thing to do. Here we have Miami before beach nourishment and afterwards. So beach nourishment is a non-structural approach to supplement the sediment budget. We are artificially providing extra sand to increase the net budget to be either neutral or hopefully positive. The problem is, it's like relying on your grandmother to give you a check Christmas to satisfy the fact that you don't make enough during the year to pay for everything you buy. You're going to have her every year supplement your budget. And that's what happens with beach nourishment. Now, the reality is, it does provide a beach where a beach was not present before. Here we have seawall, and then we've got a beach nourishment plan where you pumped sand offshore to onshore, and you created a beach. But because that's a one-time supplement of sediment, this beach, is slowly eroding. But there's an economic value to that beach in terms of recreation, tourists coming into Galveston. So maybe it's worth the cost. And in fact, because there are groins in this area where the beach was nourished, the beach actually stuck around, didn't erode as fast as people thought. So they thought it would have about an 8-year half-life, and it's probably a 10 or 12-year half-life. But we still have to bring in more sand, and sand is expensive. Increasingly expensive as we use up the limited amounts of sand resources offshore. Okay. Now, if you look at the long-term rate of shoreline erosion, where do we see net deposition? Around the jetties. A little bit here, I forget the reason. I think there's a pass there. What are we going to do? Well, look at the erosion here at the end of the seawall. What are we going to do? Well, we couldn't nourish the beach. But the other thing we could do, see this little black thing here? This is a funny shaped dune. Well, the main reason is it's not really a dune. It is a large sand-filled sock. It's called a geotube. And it's full of sand, and it's made of Kevlar. And it basically is to try to protect not the beach, but what's behind the beach. Okay, so this is kind of like a poor man's seawall. Now, this is one of the main things that the state of Texas is pushing for. But what happens if it's successful? Here's not a seawall, but a revetment. And these people put it up because this was the naturally occurring vegetation line at the time they built it. But look what happened to this beach here. It moved. But of course it caused erosion. What happened to this beach here? It's gone. Because we have trapped the sediment right here. And so up until the Supreme Court decision of 2010, you couldn't do this. This was against the law. Well, now there's a good chance you can do that. But the point is that a geotube, if successful, will only by itself protect the land at the cost of the beach. And we already see that where you have geotubes, the beaches are more narrow than where you don't have the geotubes. Well, the Bureau of Economic Geology reports that the geotubes may be effective for short-term erosion control, but how are they going to do in a big storm surge? That's yet to be tested in 2003. Their major engineering structures significantly change the sedimentary environment, and you got to continually maintain them. And by the way, you need beach nourishment if you want to mitigate the fact that otherwise the natural beach is going to erode. So you need to constantly maintain the geotubes because they can sometimes leak and get damaged, and you need beach nourishment as well. In fact, here's a case. This was the geotubes before Ike, but after some erosion. These were supposed to be completely covered, but erosion had caused them to be exposed. By the way, here's the end of the seawall over here. Okay, and this is the geotube after Ike. They couldn't handle Ike. They were punctured, they sank, they were ripped apart. Geotubes will not protect the beach from a large storm. They will protect you from small storms. They will not protect the land from large storms. They will only protect the land from small storms. Okay. In fact, here we see Bolivar Peninsula, little pieces of the geotubes completely failed. Well, now you see the problem. Whatever the Texas Coastal Management Zone is going to do, it has to recognize that we have erosion and limited options. And so we can tell you what the erosion rate will be, although we will no longer show you pictures like this because realtors and homeowners don't like the fact that their homes are marked in a zone that might be gone in 60 years. We can define what an eroding area is and what a critically eroding area is. An eroding area is moving rates greater than 2 feet per year. Okay, we can define that. We can even define a critical erosion area, and that's where the erosion could cause a major problem. But then what? Well, it's up to basically whoever is the municipal agency that controls land use in the local areas. Here's a picture of an area before Hurricane Ike. Let's look at homes 1 and 2 and also those homes with the arrows. Well, the homes with the arrows, well, they're gone. In fact, there's not even maybe here. Now the shoreline is way over here. Actually, it's behind these, so the shoreline went way over here. That's after Ike. And so there's a new vegetation line. Okay. What does that mean? Well, we could use it to define erosion zones, well discussed in your book, and maybe we could say that based on historical erosion rates, where the shoreline will be in 10 years, 30 years, 60 years defines a E10 zone, an E30 zone, an E60 zone, and maybe we could use that to maybe decide what kind of structures should be built there. Maybe nothing that you live in, if it's going to be eroded within 10 years. You can live in it, but only if you can move it in 30 years. In 60 years, well, anything's readily removed, and larger things beyond that. So that's one response. It's a response, though, that Galveston and others have chosen not to use, because the difficulty in preventing new building in these hazardous zones is property taxes. Clear and simple. Yet building in hazardous zones can be a hazard. It's not just sandy beaches. We see cliff erosion. Cliff erosion is actually a little different. It's less of a problem here in Texas, but much more of a problem in the West Coast and to a lesser extent on the East Coast. And so let me just give this one case study to show how you might try to deal with that. Notice there is a hazard zone, an impact zone, and a risk zone. And they're each color-coded from very high to very low. And so each stretch of the beach has a hazard, an impact, and a risk zone. Now, what does that mean? Actually, you might notice down here, the risk is green here, low. Even though and very low in impact because there's nothing there, but moderately high with hazard. So how do you define a hazard? Well, you basically look at the things we talked about: exposure, relative sea level, wave height, and also implicit sediment input, and also the strength of the cliff. Okay. The impact is, well, what's there to be eroded. You're talking about major cities, high population density, or what? The risk is the weighted average of the two. So you can have an area, an area that has a high risk because it's got a moderate hazard but a high impact. Conversely, it could be a low risk if it's got a high hazard but a low impact. And again, both impact and hazard have to be looked at differently depending on the nature, the geology, etc. Okay. Now, let me just add one last thing. Erosion is going on today, but relative sea level is changing as well. The land is subsiding and the ocean is rising, and so in the case of Galveston, it's risen 60 centimeters, a couple of feet in the last century. Well, that's going to cause a lot of problems. If you look at the wetland loss, coastal wetlands, and this is a major environmental issue, the coastal wetlands are eroding. Some cases because, well, we're losing them, we better said. Some cases we're developing over them. Some cases they're being flooded by sea level rise or land subsidence, sediment deficit, marsh erosion by waves. Okay. Here we have Galveston Island with the marshes out here. Before, let's say, 1956, and here we have them today. I mean, we've lost a lot, both due to erosion and development. Okay. This is the amount that was lost in red versus the amount gained. So you might think, well, is it a net wash? Not really, because first of all, the total amount of marsh area is decreasing with time. That's in part because of shoreline erosion rates as well as submergence. And also what's happening is we're getting more high marsh but less low marsh. And the reason why that's important is the low marsh productivity is much higher. Ecologically, environmentally, it's a more important part of the marsh than the high marsh. Okay. Let's look at this area of Galveston along here. This is what the marsh areas and like are today, that's what it'll be in 60 years based on the amount of relative sea level rise. This is ignoring what's going on the beach. So not only is there erosion going on the beach, but the island and the marshes are getting submerged on the bay side. Okay. So if you wanted to find the hazards in living in Galveston from immediate to low, well, the immediate hazards are erosion of the open beach and loss of the low marsh on the landward side. Okay. If we look at this area here, look what's happened. Here was the marsh in the undeveloped areas, and now look at it today. Look at all the new development, and this was after this hazard mapping. So what's going to happen? Look at this area here. What do you suppose is going to happen if a big storm comes through? You're going to breach the island right here. Okay, and maybe here. There's just you've narrowed the island. You made it more susceptible to being breached, as well as losing the marshes. Here's a case post-Hurricane Carla. The island was breached in several areas. Well, look at where we are today. We built in those storm washover paths, and we've even created new ones. This is 53. Notice, first of all, the landward movement here and here. Landward movement continues here and here. Now we've got something going on here, 2004, 2006, 2015. We've not only lost marshes due to sea level rise and land due to erosion, we've increased the probability of breaching the island. So we've got a lot going on in the coastal zone, and the issue of how to deal with it, we're still working on. Hurricanes and otherwise. That's it. Have a good day.